First of all, I'd like to thank you very much for coming to Brunel University London today.
Thanks for having me.
I'd like to start by asking you about the Brexit bill. The act was passed completely unamended, and there is significant concern about the rights of EU citizens in particular, yes, and the extent to which the fact that their rights have not been recognized could trigger claims under Article 8 of the European Convention of Human Rights in particular.
Yes, so quite rightly there's real concern about the protection of EU citizens here and of course the protection of British citizens' rights abroad in Europe. What's so disappointing about the way that the bill passed is that the official Vote Leave campaign committed to protecting EU citizens' rights here in the UK, and then throughout, Theresa May and her government have come under pressure to confirm that their rights would be protected, to confirm that these were people and not bargaining chips in the process. And she's just resisted doing that, and it's really disappointing that Parliament hasn't stood up to her in the House of Commons and made sure that their rights are protected. I think it's absolutely right that there will be legal claims, and that we can expect that as the uncertainty continues and people are left in this really terrible state of limbo, people who have settled here and have families here, that they will look to the Human Rights Act to be able to make sure that their family life rights are protected, and that's of course only right.
Is this an area that Liberty plans to take action in, possibly?
Yes, definitely. So we were neutral on the outcome of the EU referendum, but believe very strongly that whatever way that vote went, there was no mandate to reduce rights protection either for EU citizens or for British nationals. And so we are going to be working very hard to make sure that the Brexit process doesn't result in diminishing rights protections. And that will be for EU citizens, it will be for British citizens abroad, it will be for victims of crime, people who want their privacy respected, issues like data protection. There are so many areas where Europe confers rights protection on the UK, and we very firmly believe at Liberty that those rights must stay intact.
I'd like to pass the Human Rights Act, and the two issues are quite interconnected. A lot of commentators argue. Where do we stand right now with the protection of the Human Rights Act? I mean, we have had a lot of backs and forths. We're not quite sure where the government is going with that.
Yes, I think that's fair to say. So, of course, it was in the manifesto that the Human Rights Act would be repealed. And every time the Conservative government have been asked about what their intentions are in relation to the Human Rights Act, they have confirmed that they still intend to scrap the Act. So they have a lot on their plates at the moment. Brexit is obviously going to take up a huge amount of the legislative agenda and a lot of political energy. But I think the threat to the Human Rights Act remains a very real one, in that the Conservative Party is committed to scrapping it. Now, our view is that the British public don't want the Human Rights Act to be scrapped. And perhaps even more seriously is Theresa May's particular view of human rights, and her position stands in really stark contrast to the rest of her party and to the British public's view. The position that she takes is that she's against the European Convention on Human Rights as a whole. That was the position she'd taken quite publicly before she stood to become leader of the Conservative Party. She then committed to shelving that particular proposal. But then over Christmas, it was very disappointing to see leaks from a senior source coming out saying that Theresa May's intention was to put in her 2020 manifesto the intention to pull the UK out of the European Convention. And I don't think you can really underestimate how serious that is. We have never had a Prime Minister who has criticised the Convention. We've had plenty of people talk about whether the Human Rights Act could be improved. Now, of course, my very strong view is that the Human Rights Act could not be improved and that we lose it at our peril. But to go even further and to say that actually we should pull out of that post-World War II settlement that is the European Convention on Human Rights, that's a very radical departure from previous policy. We don't think that that's a departure that's supported by the Conservative Party, and we think it will be incredibly controversial if it goes into the manifesto. But that's the next big fight, I think.
If we can attempt to dig a little bit more deeply, where does this antipathy generate? You know, where was it generated? How can we interpret it?
Well, there are so many theories. I mean, I think there are a number of prejudices which are being brought to light by this discussion about human rights. So the first is that it's pretty clear that Theresa May and her Conservative Party are anti-immigration, that they are fairly intent on creating a two-tier rights system, one for British nationals and then one for other people. And that might be other because you're not a British citizen, but it could also be other because you look not British, or you don't sound British, or you don't subscribe to British values or practice a religion that we think of as British. So I don't think it's necessarily just migrants. But Theresa May was a Home Secretary for 6 years, and she battled on immigration for that entire time. And I think issues of deportation have dogged her time in politics, and she is determined to get her own back, effectively. The sad thing is that, of course, she could tell the story very differently. She talks about Abu Qatada a lot, and that seems to have been a very defining moment in her politics, when the European Court of Human Rights told her that she couldn't return Abu Qatada to a trial which would have included evidence obtained by torture. But actually that's a very positive human rights story, because what happened was that it required Theresa May and the UK government to go to Jordan and to seek an assurance from the Jordanese government that they wouldn't use that evidence. That assurance was duly given, and Abu Qatada was deported. So it's a great success story about diplomatic conversations and living our values. But unfortunately, I think it really stuck in her craw, and as a result, she's intent on weakening rights protections, particularly for minority groups.
How do we counter these threats then? I know Liberty has a very active campaign. Universities have begun to be more active here. We, as you know, we're launching a project today that aims specifically to enhance and increase awareness amongst the public, amongst young people in particular, about the Human Rights Act. I mean, do you consider that this is important, that this should be one of our priorities?
Absolutely. I think awareness raising about human rights is essential, and this project is really, really important, particularly in times like these. One of the things that we've seen is that in the UK, we don't have a strong rights culture. So it's not like in the US, where people have a very strong emotional connection to the Constitution, and that will be anyone, whether you're a Democrat or Republican, you understand that the Constitution protects you as a citizen. In this country, our Human Rights Act is really quite young. It only came into force in 2001. It's not part of the cultural imagination in the same way as a constitution would be. And we haven't had a history, or a recent history, of being invaded and then suffering the overweening powers of a totalitarian state. I think sadly what that means is there is some culture of complacency when it comes to rights, and there has been a very effective spin project by successive governments of all colours about human rights being for rapists, paedophiles, terrorists, and not explaining that actually human rights are for ordinary men and women and their families up and down the country, being used every day. And I think that's where people need to understand that what human rights do can actually be very important, but also very mundane. They are regulating every time a police officer stops a young person to search them. They're regulating every time a doctor gives treatment, or an old lady gets put in a nursing home, or a kid gets taken into residential care. All of those interactions between citizen and state, the balance of power is regulated by human rights, and we would be very much at risk and very lost without that regulation. That's a story that I don't think has been properly told, and that's the challenge of the coming years, is to really help people understand why human rights are important for them, and why if we don't have them, then our whole democratic system is undermined.
I echo all that 100%. Can I ask about Martha Spurrier, the person, the director of Liberty? What led you to become a human rights expert, a human rights lawyer? What generated this passion for the protection of core liberties and fundamental human rights?
Well, it wasn't something that was a calling for me since I was 3 years old. I'm not one of those people who wanted to be a lawyer since I started nursery school. But during my degree, I did a history degree, and I did a lot of work on political theory. So I did lots of work on feminism, I did work on Hobbes, and I was really preoccupied in an intellectual, academic sense in power relationships, basically. That's what intrigued me, and the structures that you could put in place to have transparency and accountability. I'm lucky enough never to have suffered a human rights violation, so it was quite a kind of academic appreciation of those issues. And then I left university and had no idea what to do next, sort of armed with a history degree, which doesn't necessarily prepare you for anything in particular, and thought while I was figuring out next steps, I should do some volunteering. So I started volunteering at my local prison, which was Wormwood Scrubs. And visit number one, you know, I walked into this Victorian massive institution and saw there exactly what these power dynamics are all about, that's really the sharp end, the state using its powers of coercion and control. You know, of course, maybe people entirely appropriate that they're locked up, but it was so clear to me that in that very closed space, away from public scrutiny, away from the scrutiny of the media, even tiny abuses of power were so potent and so important. The volunteering I was doing was kind of helping with little complaints and small issues, but whenever something serious came up, the lawyers came in, and the lawyers were the ones that were able to help these prisoners navigate the kind of labyrinthine issues that they were facing and stand up to the power of the state, which was of course much bigger than them. And that to me was very fascinating, and yes, I think it ignited something in me that seemed both very practically important but also very intellectually interesting. And then from there I trained to be a lawyer and then was a barrister representing clients, and then that's all the inspiration you need, because you're always fighting on behalf of somebody and trying to get them justice and accountability.
Of course. And if you had one piece of advice for our young generations of students who might wish to go into human rights, what would that be?
I would say don't be afraid of taking a kind of indirect route. I think if you want to be a human rights lawyer, then you are in the business of human relationships and empathy and compassion and hard fighting and many losses. And so while legal skills are really important, life skills are equally as important. So it's a really competitive field to get into. If you don't get into it when you're 22, you can go off and do something else. You can work for an NGO, work for a law clinic, work for a citizens advice bureau, and all of that will be such valuable experience to then, if you want to then eventually get into practicing human rights law. I think it's such a diverse job. You know, when you're representing people, often you're acting as a counsellor, or you're acting as a friend, or you're trying to sort out other issues that they have in their lives. So your legal skills are important, but so are so many other things. And so if you can practice all of those and then come to it later, then I think you'll be a more well-rounded lawyer as a result.
Perhaps a final question. Do you feel there is a scope for closer collaboration between the third sector that is doing all this wonderful work and academia and academic scholars who, as we said, they're beginning to engage with impact and with research? What do you feel about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, collaboration is always a good thing when it's done well. I think it makes you more powerful. It means that you can exert greater influence, reach different audiences. But I think particularly in relation to the third sector and academia, there should be much greater links. One of the things I feel at the moment is that people look at politicians and there is such a dearth of trust and there's such a dearth of evidence-based policy making. Promises are made and walked all over all the time. In a way, I think it's time for the third sector and academics to step up and say, well, actually, civil society can offer some clear answers here, can offer a really principled path, which is also practical and workable. And I think that's where academic research merged with campaigning and policy analysis can be incredibly effective. And I think a lot of people feel disenfranchised at the moment, and a lot of people feel pretty frightened about what we're facing in the years to come. So those kinds of alliances, those kinds of coalitions will really draw very wide support, I would hope also from young people.
Again, I couldn't agree more. Martha, thank you very much. It was an absolute delight, and I would like to wish you all the very best with your new role.
Thank you, and good luck with your project.
Thank you.